Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the opening session of the inaugural Wellbeing in Higher Education Week. My name is Rafael Florestal Cavalier, and I serve as the Assistant Vice Chancellor for Student Health and Wellbeing at the University of Illinois, Chicago. I also have the privilege of serving as the President-elect of the American College Health Association, and I'll be the moderator for today's session. Next slide. On the screen are a list of all the participating associations in Wellbeing and Higher Education Week. We welcome all of you. Next slide. First, we'll start with a bit of housekeeping. On the screen, you'll see our code of conduct. Acknowledging that we're touching on challenging topics today, we do expect attendees to be respectful and considerate both towards the speaker and to each other. We welcome you to submit questions at any time during the presentation using the Q&A pane in your Zoom controls. We'll save questions for the presenter and answer as many as possible at the end of the presentation. If you have any technical issues, please contact us in the chat or hop in the NASPA Zoom help desk. I'm entering the link to that in the chat now so that you see it. This session is being recorded and will be available on the event website. Before I introduce our esteemed speaker, I'd like to give everyone an overview of this event, why it came to be, who's participating, and what we're hoping for you to gain after this week. Raising literacy and advancing the conversation is the tagline of this event, and that's for a reason. The term well-being is being used everywhere these days, but we're not all on the same page about what that means, especially on college campuses. Maybe the most important thing to know about well-being is that it's about systems. Systems include the individuals within them. The individual wellness of your students, your teams, and yourself is essential, but they're also bigger than any one person. Systems are the environment we're in, the structures that shape our world, and the interconnectedness of it all. Changing systems means none of us can do it alone, which is why there are 21 higher education associations participating in Wellbeing Week. The goal is for all of us to come together in dialogue around well-being to help all of our members just understand well-being just a little bit better. We encourage you to use this week as an opportunity to explore well-being from another perspective. Attend a session hosted by a group that you're unfamiliar with. Actively engage with their members. Reach out to colleagues on your own campus to begin or further conversation. Make well-being part of the work you do every day. With those goals in mind, I'm pleased to introduce our keynote speaker today. Dr. Kevin McClure is the Murphy Distinguished Scholar of Education and Associate Professor of Higher Education at the University of North Carolina, Wilmington. He also serves as Director of Public Engagement for the Alliance for Research on Regional Colleges. He is an expert on college leadership, management, and finance, especially at broad access institutions. He's the co-editor of Regional Public Universities, Addressing Misconceptions and Analyzing Contributions and Unlocking Opportunity Through Broadly Accessible Institutions. Dr. McClure's public scholarship covers a range of topics, and throughout the pandemic, he has written viral articles on morale, burnout, disengagement, staffing, and leadership in higher education. He's currently working on a 3-year research project to improve the higher education workplace, including a book titled The Caring University. Dr. McClure will be looking at systems change in the workforce, an integral part of overall campus well-being. We chose to open Wellbeing Week with this lens because this is real for our members. Wellbeing is necessarily inclusive of everyone, but by nature of the work we do, students are often the focus. And that has had and continues to have real impacts on all of us. I'm so pleased to welcome Dr. McClure.
Well, thank you all so much for that warm introduction. I really couldn't be more excited to help you kick off this fantastic week. I have been scrolling through all of the presentations, and I'm just thrilled to see so many important conversations happening in higher education. So it is really an honor to be able to share this time and space with you all. As you all were doing your introductions, I loved seeing the cross section of institutions and states that are represented. I also saw a few former and current students, so a special shout out to my students from the University of North Carolina, Wilmington. I am here today to talk about what it means to create a caring college or university, which for me really means an organization that prioritizes the well-being of staff and faculty. And a big idea that I'm going to share really throughout this presentation is that well-being isn't just an individual prerogative. It's also an organizational responsibility. So this is something that colleges and universities assume as human service institutions, as knowledge organizations, and as employers. So I have been researching how we can improve the higher education workplace for the better part of the last 4 years, and that has culminated in a book that should be out in 2025. And over the course of that research, I've had the privilege of interviewing over 120 staff, faculty, and senior leaders at institutions across the country. And I have learned a ton from these interviews. But there is one interview in particular that has really stayed with me. And I'd like to share some of that participant's story as a way of beginning this presentation with you all. So in my book, I call this participant Mila, so that is a pseudonym. And Mila and I first connected as I was working on an article about the lack of career pathways in higher education. And I think her experience can really help us get a handle on the organizational nature of some of the workplace problems that I'll be discussing in this presentation, but also how we can set the conditions for well-being among staff and faculty. All right, I'm going to walk us through a chronology of Mila's career so far. So there's going to be some details here, but I think the details are going to be important for what we'll be revisiting at a later point. Mila began her career in higher education in 1999 as a data entry clerk at a regional public university, and she was making $19,000 a year. She continued working in that same office for over the next 10 years. And she eventually became the office manager. Because that office elected not to fill her previous position, Mila continued to do it. So she was doing her previous responsibilities plus her new job. As she put it, she was doing two jobs for the price of one. After the 2008 recession, Mila's university experienced budget cuts, and a consultant at that time recommended that they reduce the number of administrative assistants. So Mila got moved to an academic college across the institution. And at that same time, she started to pursue her interest in art. So she started taking courses towards a bachelor's degree in art history, and she started to teach herself graphic design. There was a faculty member who picked up on the fact that she had some skills. And so they asked Mila if she would design a new logo and help to redesign a website for the department. And pretty soon, all of the other departments in the centers were asking for Mila's help in graphic design and website design. So that led to her being hired as an executive assistant to the dean. However, she didn't actually get the title of executive assistant or the pay of executive assistant. The college at the time said that it didn't have the budget to do so. Even though Mila's responsibilities had expanded, she was helping with accreditation reports, she was helping with faculty contracts. She was not earning the same as other executive assistants. So at that point, she decided that she needed to make a switch, and she became an actual executive assistant for an associate provost. Now, at this point, Mila is 15 years into her higher ed career, and she's making $35,000 a year. She's again starting to cover for gaps in her new office. So she's pulling data, she's designing assessment reports. And after she completes her bachelor's degree in art history, she is eligible for an open coordinator position in the office. So Mila told me she was not actually that interested in the coordinator job. It wasn't that different from what she was already doing. However, she decided that she wanted to put in for it because the title really mattered to her. You see, she had really felt as if she wasn't able to shake off the title of administrative assistant. And it didn't matter what projects she took on or if she had learned new skills, she was always seen as a secretary. And as a woman of color, Mila really felt that her race and her gender placed boundaries around how her skills and her intelligence and value were perceived at the institution. After Mila was hired as a coordinator, the pandemic began. There was a hiring freeze. So instead of filling Mila's previous job, again, she was covering and doing two jobs again. She asked her supervisor if this was a situation that was going to change, and he said that his hands were tied. Even though hiring at the university was frozen, Mila wasn't, so she continued her education. She earned a master's degree in instructional technology. And finally, a friend encouraged her to apply for a project manager job in information technology at the institution. She was hired and she loves her new role. She feels that for the first time, she's being adequately compensated for her talent. She's got considerably more autonomy in the workplace. She can work from home a few days per week, and she's received new training in project management. She, for the first time, has funds to attend conferences and other professional development. So, in a lot of ways, my interview with Mila ended on a high note, and I could almost see the university PR story about Mila's 2 decade long career and her service to the institution. But at the same time, there was something that really troubled me about my conversation with Mila. And I finally stopped and added it all up. And it took 23 years for Mila to get to that point. 23 years. And so I was uneasy about this, but I wanted to see what Mila thought about it. And she didn't mince words. She said, it didn't have to take this long. I definitely have felt exploited, and it's not just me. So, what Mila was referring to there was that there are lots of other people in a position like her, many other administrative assistants at her institution who are overwhelmingly women of color. And as she told me, quote, we do so much more than they see. So Mila's story is uniquely hers, but I hear echoes of her experience in the scores of interviews that I've conducted. This idea of it's not just me is really important, I think, as a way of underscoring that theme that we'll revisit over the course of this presentation, that we ought to be thinking a little bit beyond the individual. Like Mila, I think there are a lot of higher ed employees who give generously, they work tirelessly for the benefit of institutions and the students that they serve, but they do so despite working conditions and cultures that can undervalue their talent, can sometimes exploit their labor, can compromise their mental and physical health. So for every story like Mila's, I think about the numerous staff and faculty who have left colleges and universities, and they've left for organizations that can better demonstrate care for employees. So these are places that better nurture their growth, that fairly reward contributions, that respect that they are humans with lives and responsibilities outside of work. So in this next part of the presentation, I want to wade into some serious and complex challenges in the higher education workplace. And my goal isn't for us to despair or to dwell in the negative, but I really think that building better organizations starts with a clear-eyed understanding of these issues. So this notion of leaving, of searching for greener pastures, has been particularly prevalent during the COVID-19 pandemic when unprecedented numbers of staff and faculty question their future in higher ed as part of what's kind of popularly been called the Great Resignation. So data have raised alarm about higher turnover or higher risk of turnover among faculty and staff in various positions and departments, from admissions to human resources and financial aid. One survey from Coupa HR found that 65% of respondents indicated an intent to leave in the next 12 months. They were at least somewhat likely to seek other employment. 84% of respondents to a NASPA survey indicated that stress leading to burnout was a major reason why professionals leave student affairs work. One survey from TIAA Institute found that 45% of respondents don't feel as if they are paid fairly. We've got hiring managers who have reported more vacancies than in the past and experiencing greater challenges filling jobs. And so, in a lot of ways, this is a moment without parallel in the recent history of higher education. And it's upended decades of accepted norms and really redefined how we think about work and what we view as a good job. There's a desire to think of the Great Resignation as a discrete event. There's something with a start and a finish. There's a clear, measurable outcome in terms of turnover. But as is so often the case, reality is more complicated. I consider the Great Resignation a spike in a trend line. So it's the intensification of problems that predate the pandemic and really continue to this day. So, as an umbrella concept, the Great Resignation describes not one outcome, but instead multiple shifts in the workplace. And I've come to call these the 4 R's of the Great Resignation: reevaluation, reassignment, resistance, and then finally, resignation. So, reevaluation is when employees are examining their own priorities and what they desire or expect from the workplace and from employers. So, they may be asking more questions, they may be emphasizing their own well being or the well being of colleagues, they may be dialing back on the time and the energy that they're willing to give to work. Reassignment is when employees pursue new roles or duties within their current organization. So they may switch jobs or find better alignment between their own priorities and workplace expectations. They may negotiate a change to their title, to their duties, to hours, to workload, or even location. Resistance is when employees are adopting covert or even overt ways of pushing against the status quo. They may organize other employees for collective action. They may advocate for policy changes through existing governance bodies, or they may refuse to participate in what they see as problematic practices associated with the status quo. And then, of course, there is resignation. So employees that are resigning their position at an institution, they may be moving to another institution. They may be leaving higher education altogether, or they may be stepping away from the workforce to consider their options. So at one point, I was wrapping up a virtual presentation, much like this, at an institution, and an anonymous attendee posted a question through the Zoom chat feature. And what they asked is the higher education workplace really so bad, or are people just tired of the pandemic? It's a valid question. I think higher education workers are tired, have been tired of the pandemic and what it has meant for their work and the workplace. I think in a lot of ways, the pandemic forced people into work situations that made it harder for them to feel safe or effective. Balancing work and caregiving was challenging in the best of circumstances, but it became almost impossible because of school closures and disruptions to healthcare. Leaders were facing really hard choices during the pandemic, sometimes under significant external pressures, and often in the case of constantly evolving information. So it was up to employees down the organizational chart to implement some of the plans, even if some of those plans were at odds with their values. So I think the question really was, maybe the only change that higher education really needs is for us to get on the other side of the pandemic. Uh, but here's the thing. I've been digging into the research, and it really makes clear that the pandemic alone isn't to blame for things like this widespread reevaluation of priorities, increased unionization in higher education, heightened turnover. I mean, yes, the pandemic created a unique set of challenges. I think few of us in higher education were prepared to teach and house and feed students in the presence of a deadly virus. Is it too soon for us to talk about and to laugh about the plexiglass? Or are we at a place that we can look back now and laugh about the plexiglass a little bit? But I really think that in a lot of ways, the pandemic largely dialed up pre-existing stressors. As one staff member in student affairs I interviewed put it, the pandemic, quote, shined a light on existing cracks in the foundation. Now, because of the stress and the threats to safety, some of this values-based conflict in the higher education workplace, researchers like me have turned to three concepts to make sense of shifts associated with the Great Resignation. I want to walk through each of these concepts, not just because they illuminate some of the employee experiences that I think precipitated the four R's of the Great Resignation, but also because this is an event partially about well-being literacy. And so if there was ever an event for us to walk through concepts to make sure that we're clear on them, now would be it. So let's start with burnout. Uh, Although burnout is often measured by asking individuals how frequently they experience exhaustion, cynicism towards work, reduced professional efficacy on the job, the World Health Organization emphasizes that burnout is an occupational syndrome resulting from chronic workplace stress. So there's an awful lot of talk about burnout. We're probably burned out on burnout, but the reality is that we still often get burnout wrong in these conversations. And so I want us to pause on this idea of it being an occupational syndrome that's resulting from chronic workplace stress. So one of the pioneers of burnout research, Christina Maslach, attributed burnout to really failures at an organizational level. So these are failures that are evident in poor working conditions, like overly demanding workload, insufficient rewards, inequities and unfairness, a lack of community. And there's a 2018 Gallup survey of 7,500 workers that really confirmed these causes as the top five drivers of burnout. So things like unfair treatment at work, lack of role clarity, lack of communication and support from managers, and unreasonable time pressures. So, what research is really pushing us to understand is that burnout isn't just about people struggling to cope with stress, it's about people struggling in workplaces where the stress never subsides. Personally, this was a really important message for me to internalize because my own personal struggles with burnout is partially what has pushed me into this research. And for a long time, I felt very alone in that experience. And many of the responses that I was hearing from my own employers were about what I ought to be doing individually and wasn't thinking about what this meant for us as an organization. Researchers define disengagement as distancing yourself cognitively, emotionally, even physically from work. So, one theory posits that disengagement is about whether there are conditions in place for you to be able to fully invest in the work. So, these conditions include whether the work is meaningful, whether employees feel safe and can bring their true selves to work, whether there's sufficient resources. So, if faculty and staff encounter workplace cultures in which they can't openly talk about aspects of their identities, or they feel like policies prevent them from growing professionally, they're less likely to invest in their work, and they're less likely to see this as a place where they want to invest. And then lastly, demoralization involves workers who are kind of struggling to bridge a chasm between their personal values and some of the outside forces shaping work. So Doris Santoro, who is a philosopher of education, has researched demoralization among primary and secondary school teachers for over a decade. And she talks about demoralization as when the conditions of being an educator change so dramatically that some of the moral rewards that had previously been available, even in really, really hard work, like teaching is, all of a sudden become inaccessible. And so they said that the moral rewards are activated when educators feel that they're doing what is right in terms of their students and the teaching profession and themselves. So demoralization is what happens when teachers feel like policies and practices prevent them from being able to bring the values that were the reason that they got into the work in the first place to the profession. Now, when I interviewed higher education workers about their morale, and this was in the second year of the pandemic, what they revealed was kind of a pervasive frustration that leaders didn't learn from lessons of the previous year. They were exercising a kind of selective amnesia about the trauma that it brought. Uh, a lot of them talked about leaders that weren't listening. They weren't taking questions about plans and meetings. They maybe weren't transparently answering the questions that they received. So there was this kind of values-based conflict that emerged as staff and faculty really wanted compassion. They wanted thoughtful answers. They wanted honesty in the face of kind of elevated risk. And instead, what they got was a lot of toxic positivity, where the response was to say, everything is fine, carry on, we're returning to normal in the fall, and everything will be great. And of course, these frustrations were amplified by ballooning workloads and perceptions of low compensation and inadequate staffing. So as I look across these concepts and I think about how they show up in higher education, how they show up in the interviews that I've done, I get the strong sense that higher education workers are, in a very different way than in the past, asking, is this a place that really cares about me? So there are a couple of ways that institutions, I think, have responded to that type of sentiment or question. And one way is what I call the individual frame. So this frame says that burnout and turnover are about individuals who are having a hard time setting boundaries. Maybe they have really high, what the institution perceives as too high expectations for what the institution is able to do. Or my personal favorite, they maybe say this is about Gen Z employees who don't want to do the work. And so by taking these problems and individualizing them, we tend to get individualized solutions. So things like overly relying on self-care as a solution, or appealing to workers' passion or sense of mission to help them overcome obstacles, or asking employees to download a meditation app. There's another frame that says that there are these external pressures or conditions that are really driving the employee experience. And according to this frame, institutions would do more if they had more resources. We would do more if we didn't have the political context that we're in. We would do more if we didn't have this enrollment challenge. And so if we could just achieve X enrollment or Y retention rate or Z ranking, then we would be able to develop some solutions. And I think this frame has a way of rhetorically and materially impeding any real consideration of solutions, because it makes employees' concerns secondary to institutional concerns, even though really employees kind of are the institution. Now, there's, I think, kind of a kernel of truth to both of these, right? There are instances in which individuals can, through self-care and through managing work, help to overcome personal challenges or help to overcome some of these workplace challenges. There's certainly a case to be made for resources and politics playing into what people experience on the job. There's no doubt about that. But I find both of them lacking in certain ways as well. I think individualized solutions like overly relying on self-care have a tendency to not get at the root cause of some of these problems. And then by blaming external pressures, it can be an easy out for organizations who I think still have a lot of room for making choices. And so I've been pushing for higher education leaders in particular to be thinking, and this is true for all of us, right? So as I'm saying leaders, I think all of us in different ways can be leaders. So I want us to step into this idea of an organizational frame. And so what I mean by that is I'm trying to encourage us to recognize the cultural and structural determinants of problems at an organizational level. This doesn't mean that workplace problems are experienced the same by everyone. There are certainly folks who, by virtue of luck or privilege, are able to evade certain workplace problems better than others or in a different way than others. It doesn't remove individual agency in the workplace. It's simply saying that we as organizations, through our norms and through our structures and practices, have a way of setting workplace cultures and conditions that shape the employee experience, and we can do so in problematic ways. So if we take this organizational frame and we kind of circle back around to Mila's story, we are able to see in her experience, I think, an abundance of organizational problems. And these are problems based on my research that are quite common in higher education. So they include chronically low pay, unsustainable workloads, inadequate mechanisms for rewarding good work, being pushed into career silos and boxes, lacking clear career pathways, having one's agency bounded because of who you are or how you look. So these are problems that I think flow from institutional choices that reflect collective norms and values. And then those choices can become routine practice. They become the way things are done. They become codified in our practices, in our policies, our handbooks, even our organizational charts. And so what I'm trying to really underscore is that in the face of these organizational problems, we need to be thinking about organizational solutions. And so this doesn't mean that we throw self-care out the window, but it does mean that I think self-care only goes so far if it's not paired with organizational care, right? So it only does so much to encourage me to make sure that I'm going for a walk if after I go for a walk, I come right back to the same job that hasn't changed any. It doesn't do me a ton of good to download a counseling app, for example, or to pursue therapy if it's the case that I'm still in a toxic workplace where there is chronic stress that is going to lead to burnout. Those are a set of challenges where my individual ability to cope can certainly be helpful, but it is not going to get at the underlying cause of some of those issues. And so I'm proposing that we start moving towards a model that builds in this notion of organizational care. And I think that the interassociation definition of well-being does a nice job of underscoring this when they say that well-being needs to be a multifaceted goal. And this is something that I think we should really underline, a shared responsibility for the entire institution. So, having spent a little bit of time in some of those problems, complex challenges, I want us to start walking now into this idea of organizational care and what could that look like. And in my work, I have been playing around with this idea of the caring university. So, what is the caring university? Well, it's not a badge of honor. It's not some sort of checklist that once you arrive at the end of, you're able to receive this Carnegie designation, for example. Instead, the Caring University is a way of describing a type of aspiration more so than a reality. So far in my work, I haven't come across an institution that I can confidently say has arrived at being a caring university. But instead, I wanted to try to get at this idea of a college or university that is in a collective, ongoing, proactive way, enacting organizational change in support of employee well-being. The collective part is really important. So this is something that involves everyone across the organization. It's ongoing in the sense that this has no end date. Caring for one another and supporting employee well-being is a nonstop endeavor. And proactive in the sense that I think there are a lot of workplace initiatives in higher education that are reactive. We only increase grad student stipends when there's a risk that they may walk out. We're only going to pay for an engagement survey when it becomes clear that our turnover has increased. And instead, what I'm calling for is to say that we're proactive about this. We don't have to wait for a crisis situation to care. So it's easy for someone like me to proclaim that we need organizational change or reform, but a little bit harder to answer. Okay, so organizational change towards what and how? I think pursuing the Caring University calls for what Adriana Kizar, who's probably the foremost scholar on change in higher education, calls deep or second order change. So this is change that's so substantial, it alters the operating systems, the underlying values, and the culture of an organization. So deep change is a process, and its success often depends on a large number of actors who are coming together and using multiple approaches. So we sometimes have a tendency to hear process and assume that it's a linear model where there's kind of a change checklist that we can follow. And the reality is that deep change is about learning as an organization. It's about customizing a set of ideas. It's about revising when things don't go according to plan. And so we had to be prepared for the fact that this is going to take time and it is going to be a process. My inspiration for this comes in part from the US Surgeon General's 5 essential components of workplace well-being, each of which is supposed to center employee voice and equity, and then incorporates human needs. And so this frame of workplace well-being is depicted here. So we see, for example, this notion of protection from harm, which includes the human needs for safety and security, connection and community, which includes the human need for social support and belonging, work-life harmony, which includes the human need for autonomy and flexibility, mattering at work, which includes the human need for dignity and meaning, and then opportunity for growth, which includes the human need for learning and for accomplishment. And again, if you were to line this up against the interassociation definition for individual and community well-being, you'd see a lot of conceptual alignment there. So a good question here is, why is the Surgeon General giving attention to employee well-being? This seems like something that should be in the domain of maybe the Department of Commerce or something else. And they say it's because workplace well-being is a critical priority for public health, with numerous and cascading impacts for individuals, for families, for organizations, and communities. And so the bottom line here is that reducing stress, encouraging forms of community in the workplace is, in fact, a national health concern. So then what does this mean in terms of what the Caring University is designed to do in support of employee well-being? And I've identified a range of approaches that are exemplifying 6 overarching organizational changes. And these are really designed to speak to organizational cultures and structures that give rise to those problems that I think are fueling the Great Resignation. So they include making the employee experience a strategic priority. So a challenge for you all is to take a look at the strategic plan of your institution and the extent to which employees are included as part of the organization's goals for itself. To what extent are employees reflected in other guiding documents at the institution, such as the value statement or the mission? In my own review, what I have found is that employees are often absent. The idea of the Caring University includes creating working cultures and conditions for real workers versus ideal workers, and we'll revisit that in just a moment. But the idea is to think about ways in which we design policies and practices that reflect our humanity. Committing to professional growth and fair compensation, we will also return to. I think we got a sense from Mila's story about some of the problems that this change is designed to speak to. Pursuing cultural and structural change for equity and belonging, empowering employees' rights and voice. These two that I've just mentioned are critically important because there are a range of forces right now that are actively trying to erode these in the workplace. And so this idea that we should be pushing for equity in the workplace and giving employees voice are so important. The reality is that many of the changes that we are attempting to pursue in higher education are impossible without these. And so there's good reason why they are so central to the US Surgeon General's components of workplace well-being, and they are part of how I've been thinking about the Caring University. And then lastly, we have to think about how, as organizations, we are cultivating and sustaining caring leaders. And so these aren't designed to map perfectly onto the Surgeon General's framework, but they kind of share a common vision of what's required to create organizations that better attend to employee well-being. Now, I would love to be able to walk through each of these in detail. I'm going to limit myself a bit to two that I think could be especially pertinent to the conversations that you all are having this week. And I'll introduce some of the approaches under them as a way of explaining what it could look like to address some of these problems organizationally. So the two that we'll look at are this idea of humanizing some of our policies and then thinking about career pathways. So one of the people that I interviewed for this project and someone whose narrative is likewise in the book, I used the pseudonym Lane for her, and she worked as a case manager in interpersonal violence prevention. When the pandemic started, the number of students that Lane's office served took off, and really Lane's caseload skyrocketed as well. So new cases were materializing much faster than Lane and her colleagues could clear existing ones. Her office also assumed responsibility for distributing over $1 million in emergency aid to students. So these were students that were facing hardships such as losing family members to the virus, being in the hospital for lengthy stays, being laid off from jobs on which they depended. So really, Lane was doing everything in her power to stay afloat. Making things worse, Lane's office was experiencing the type of turnover and transitions that were all too common as part of the Great Resignation. So what she told me is that she has had maybe 3 months in her almost 4 years that her office has been fully staffed. And so the expectation was that they were always operating at over full caseloads. Lane's supervisor moved up in the organization to fill a vacancy, and they quickly realized that that person had been covering for the office in a lot of ways. They had taken on a large caseload themselves. They had been working late into the evening. And so all of a sudden, with their departure, all that work had a way of just trickling down to the rest of them. So the university definitely had its hands full with the current students it was serving, but it also had as a major goal increasing enrollment. So Lane really couldn't compute why the university didn't hire more staff or recalibrate expectations. So she said, quote, instead of having some sort of realistic standard of what human beings can handle, it just kept coming. Lane brought her concerns to supervisors, and she said, quote, people above me talk like they care, but nobody's doing anything. So I could be here another 5 years, and I don't know that anything would change. And so that's why I ultimately decided to start searching. So Lane, I think, felt that staying in her job required her to be superhuman. So she wasn't someone who was bound by the limits of a body. She was immune to the emotional toll of working with students in crisis. She was willing to sacrifice her own well-being and put in extra hours for the good of the cause. So in other words, she was someone who could work in a constant state of emergency and really not be slowed down by obligations to family, to friends, to community. So, and I think to be successful and really to survive, Lane needed to embody the quote unquote ideal worker. And so this is someone who, in the words of sociologist Jane Acker, exists only for the work and doesn't have other, quote, imperatives of existence that impinge on the job. So Lane's not alone in feeling that her job expectations didn't really match the realities of being a living, breathing human. I think there are many practices and policies that stem from this ideal worker norm. And it has a way of shaping how we structure job expectations, the types of messages that we send to new professionals, how we set expectations. And, and it's the case that these norms affect all of us in all employees in higher education, but I think they can be especially hard for people who are caregivers, because they have these obligations to other people, individuals who are disabled, those who are navigating loss and grief. And so the result is that these are workers that experience a workplace that fails to treat them as whole people. So in response to this idea that we sometimes create workplace conditions that can be dehumanizing, I've identified 4 organization level approaches under this idea of humanizing approaches. And these are really designed to prioritize safety, wholeness, dignity, flexibility, and they include resetting our professional norms. So what are those messages that we are sending to new professionals, to people that are in graduate prep programs, even for our doctoral students as they're stepping into faculty roles, improving our supports and our leave policies for caregivers and individuals that are navigating loss, using principles of universal design to structure policies that are equitable, accessible, flexible for the most number of people, and then expanding our options for hybrid and remote work. And so I'll just select one of these as a way of kind of exemplifying a little bit further what I'm talking about here. So we'll look at the example of leave policies. So higher education is often categorized as a human service, but the reality is that our leave policies do a pretty poor job of recognizing the humanity of employees. We often fail to capture what it means to bring another human into the world, or to recover when we lose a loved one. So in the higher education world, as in many workplaces, we rely heavily on FMLA as a way of granting leave to individuals who need it. But the reality is that only 44% of US workers are even eligible for FMLA. According to Coupa HR, only around 40% of institutions offer paid parental leave. We are one of under 10 countries in the world, not even quote unquote developed countries, 10 countries in the world that doesn't have a national policy for paid parental leave. Only around, by one estimate, 45% of institutions are offering some type of on-site childcare. This is actually a percentage that has been declining. And then across the US workplace, on average, US workers can only expect about 3 days of bereavement leave in the case of losing a loved one. And so in a lot of ways, I think we're facing a situation here again where our workplace policies are simply not good enough in order to support humans. We are all people, I think, who are placed in caregiving responsibilities at one point or another, whether that's with children or parents or other loved ones. Every single US worker will experience at least one tragic loss over the time of their career, and in that case would be in need of some type of leave, or maybe in need of some type of bereavement leave. So organizational care means paid parental leave for all employees. So not just for certain categories of employees, all employees would be eligible, supporting elder care, providing or subsidizing childcare, and then creating this space for the very human common experience of loss. So as an example, the Work-Life program at the University of Washington offers employees 6 different on-site childcare centers that serve over 450 children. So this bucks this national trend of declining on-campus childcare options. They would like to be able to expand that and offer even more, but coming from a place that has 0 on-site childcare options, the notion of 6 on-site childcare centers doesn't sound too bad to me. Option B is an organization that was founded by Sheryl Sandberg to provide compassionate everyday advice for people who are navigating loss. And they note that kind of best in class companies and organizations offer 20 days of paid bereavement leave. They also recommend that organizations allow employees to take those days off non-consecutively because grief isn't a one and done kind of experience. They also recommend that beyond bereavement leave, they think about compassionate leave, which is more flexible. And it's designed to be kind of a catch-all category for any time you experience a life-altering type of hardship. So I come from a place where we have experienced, for example, hurricanes, and people have had to rebuild homes at the same time that they're attempting to do their jobs. And so these are practices that research shows can increase morale and also increase retention. So there's a clear theme in my research, which is that for too many workers in higher education, we are living in a land of dead-end jobs. So what do I mean by that? A dead-end job is one in which the culture or the structure of the workplace stifles career progression and professional growth. So this includes situations where we have insufficient career ladders and pathways. There may be minimal onboarding and training offered. Um, I'm thinking here about flat offices where there's kind of a long-term manager and then like a bullpen of new professionals who are expected to put in their time and then eventually leave. It includes kind of outsourcing professional development to other organizations and oftentimes expecting that employees self-finance those growth opportunities. So my first job in higher education, which I loved, was a dead-end job. It was a job where I was on the outskirts of the organizational chart. I reported to an associate dean who was multiple levels above me in the organizational chart. There was no opportunity for me to move up. It didn't matter how hard I worked or how many hours I put in, which turned out to be a lot. There was no conversation about raises. And the only time that my career was really brought up in any kind of an intentional way, was when I was brought in and a dean explained to me that they were ending the program. And so therefore my career or my job at the time was no longer. And so this notion of a dead end job is one that I can understand pretty well in the higher ed world. And so I think oftentimes in the face of no career pathways or unclear career pathways, limited growth opportunities, there are a lot of people who feel like they don't have any option except to change jobs. And so I think about Mila as she was within her organization seeking reassignment, and she was doing so because she didn't feel as if there was much of an option except to do so. And even in those instances, the pay bump was not significant. Nevertheless, there are people who say the only way that I'm going to move up is to move out. And the only opportunity that I have to try to secure a raise or negotiate pay is by getting a new job. So to counter higher ed's history of dead-end jobs, I kind of explored what it looks like for colleges and universities to become more deliberately developmental and to weave employees' professional growth into their regular operations by thinking a little bit more intentionally about career pathways and ladders, career coaching and intentional conversations about careers, and more robust in-house professional development. And so again, I'm going to select one of these as a way of kind of diving in for a second and taking a look at this in a little bit more detail and what this can look like in practice. So when we're talking about career ladders, we're talking about steps within a given job category. So you may think of this as the ability to move from academic advisor 1 to academic advisor 2. So you're within the same job category, but there are steps within it. A career pathway is when there are a collection of positions that can be linked to one another, and when the organization or someone within the organization helps you map out those connections and see how it's possible to move from one area to the next through developmental opportunities. So this is an area where we struggle in higher education, and it's not necessarily even because we lack entirely career ladders. In some cases we do, but our career ladders are outdated. Our job classification structure hasn't been updated in some time. The salary ranges that are attached to those ladders, likewise, can be exceptionally out of date. But we tend to struggle more so with this idea of career pathways and thinking about how someone can build a career arc over time within the same organization without having to leave. So I'll lift up as examples of a career ladder. The University of South Carolina's University Advising Center has this really nice website that maps out the career ladder for academic advisors. It tells them the requirements for advancing from one step to the next. It provides instructions on how to apply for that. It offers sample application materials. It even lists the individuals that have recently been promoted up in their steps and recognizes that as an important recognition. And all of this conveys the idea that this is a place that wants people to be able to move up and in fact helps them do so. As an example of career pathways and supporting at an organizational level career pathways, the University of Virginia has the Career Navigation Center. So this is not a career navigation center for students, but a career navigation center for employees. And it provides confidential coaches, and staff are able to meet with those coaches to help develop stretch assignments that they might be able to work out with a supervisor that will help them grow in their job. It helps them identify opportunities across the university that they may be qualified for, because the reality is that many of us in our organizations aren't always clear on what those opportunities are and which ones we might be eligible for. And it, of course, helps them also develop application materials. So the idea here is that this is an organization that has invested in the idea of helping employees to see that longer term career arc and to stay at the institution. And they have found that this investment has huge returns. So for every dollar that they're spending, they're able to see a manifold return in terms of the ability to keep employees and not be spending on replacing them. So, as we think about well-being in higher education, I'm really urging you to think organizationally. And I want you to do so in a way that sees the well-being of staff and faculty as very much linked to the well-being of students. Now, I'm under no illusion that what I'm proposing in this model is easy. And in fact, over the past couple of years, there are many leaders who have expressed their support for these ideas, at least generally, but acknowledged that achieving them feels like an overwhelming project. As one faculty leader confided to me, they said, "What you're saying feels very far away from where we are." But I like to think about this in terms of it being a process. And every process starts with a step. And so rather than get too bogged down in arriving at this destination, we can think a little bit about what does it mean to start walking into this work as that initial first step. Now, we sometimes think that organizational change happens because there's like a heroic leader that steps in, or there's some game-changing incidents, and those can definitely be catalysts. But usually organizational change is more mundane. It's in the day-to-day. It's in the small acts. So all of us, I think, can be champions of change. And I'd love for each of you to think about what your zone of action or influence is within the organization. Maybe it's with student staff. Maybe it's with close colleagues. Maybe it's part of a staff senate. So as you're moving through your time in this event and you're thinking about well-being and what it means to be a part of this institutional responsibility for well-being, what is your zone of action or influence, and where could that first step for you be? So I opened this talk with the story of Mila, and this is someone who has really astounding talents, but whose experience in higher education has been hard. Uh, and really, what I want all of us to do is to imagine an alternative version of events in which Mila encountered a university that really demonstrated care for her well-being. So this is an encounter story where everything was easy and the path was cleared of all hardship, but one where we can say that, Mila didn't have to fight so hard for her talent to be recognized. She might have felt a little more comfortable trusting that processes would do right by her. She might have felt that her presence was one in which she was recognized and included and valued, rather than her presence being kind of an act of individual perseverance. So, this idea at the Caring University is about doing better for Mila and for the countless other higher ed employees who have kind of felt locked out, burned out, pushed out, and really it's about choosing right now to get started with that work. So I want to sincerely thank you all for the opportunity to share some of this with you, to explore these ideas. I hope some of them resonate and that we have a good conversation and can follow up on some of them. I absolutely welcome any correspondence, questions, comments. My email address is there. And you can also find me on LinkedIn. So thank you. Thank you all very, very much. I appreciate it.
Thank you so much, Dr. McClure. I believe you hit on several points that resonated not only with myself, but some of our colleagues, and definitely appreciate the touch on the root causes and doing this work at the systems level. And I know I have a kickoff question, but I want to make sure attendees remember that you can submit your questions in the Q&A, and I will do my best to get through as many as possible. And I already see several in there. But to get us started thinking about this event, um, in the Caring University, you emphasize that to address organizational problems, we need to not only, tend to creating space for self-care, but to also really look beyond that and look at organizational care. Similarly, several of my colleagues advocating for their institutions to become health promoting campuses emphasize the need for settings and systems approaches to advance well-being. And while your talk focuses on promoting well-being in the workplace for education staff and faculty, from your perspective, how can the organizational level changes you discuss impact student experiences?
Yeah, so this is a great question, and I'm going to get spicy for like a quick second here. And this is not spiciness directed to you at all, Raphael, but we do have this kind of tendency in higher ed as we talk about well-being, for example, for it to be primarily directed towards students. And similarly, we have had this, really phenomenal, important student success movement over the course of the last couple of decades in higher education, which again is critically important. But there's a way in which that type of framing and rhetoric has allowed us to move in ways that I think pursue those outcomes at the expense of the people who are doing the work. And I think we need to do a much better job of marrying the two together. We serve students better, we attend to their well-being better when we are thinking more holistically about well-being for everybody in the university community up and down the organizational chart. So we take the example I shared from Lane, where she's a case manager. She is working with students in distress, and she herself is at a level of nearing distress. And so it's a clear illustration to me of how do we do the work and serve those students and ensure that they've got well-being if we aren't doing the same for employees. And so I've been trying in my conversations with leaders to think about how do we get to that outcome we're after by supporting our employees, because there's only so much squeezing I think we're going to be able to do. We are, I think, going to see some of the problems and challenges and issues multiply by squeezing our employees and hoping that we get the outcomes on the other side. So, and the other thing I'll say about this is there are some leaders who are maybe going to tune out the whole idea of well-being because maybe they don't see that as their jam. But in a lot of ways, what we are talking about is the stuff of organizational effectiveness. So if you are more persuaded by organizational performance, guess where I have pulled a significant amount of my research and ideas from? It is from management and business literature. And so what they are saying is actually stuff that we as institutions could be doing better. And it's not in any way, shape, or form out of line with being an effective, well-run organization.
Awesome. Thank you for that. So another question I have, and I've seen this kind of come up in the Q&A a bit, and it kind of goes to this raising the literacy theme here, and advancing the conversation. Oftentimes, folks who might be in middle level leadership roles might be the people championing this culture change work. And I know also, being a health promotion professional, I'm often in middle management roles championing this culture change in the university context. And I've figured out that we often make assumptions about what people at different levels know when it comes to culture change and change management. And so a question that has come up is, one, how can someone who's in a middle management space kind of find their space in pushing for this change and trying to protect themselves or preserve themselves? And what do higher level leaders need to learn to be effective at facilitating culture change at the organizational level in concert with all the other work that's happening within people's kind of zone of influence?
All right, so I'm going to start at the end and then come back around. So my view on this is that our senior leaders have the most to learn when it comes to well-being literacy. That is a generalization, to be sure. And in doing this work, I have met so many thoughtful leaders that honestly give me some hope around the future of higher ed. But the other reality, I think, is that we have a significant number of leaders who have been in higher ed for a long enough period of time that the norm for them is, in fact, very far from what we're talking about here. And much of what we're discussing feels uncomfortable. It feels different from the ways in which they've operated, the reasons that they may have been promoted. And so there is likely some real limitations to what somebody in a mid-management position is going to be able to do to raise that literacy. And that's where we need to be having a national conversation where we've got our associations, we have got philanthropic organizations, we've got a kind of a group of people who are differently positioned who can push this. I'm differently positioned. I can push this and tell leaders that you are being foolish without the blowback that someone else is within the organization. And so that's part of the role that we play in this. Similarly, I see there being space for advocacy and for pushing when we are able to bring groups of mid-level folks together as kind of an organizational coalition. And so even this kind of inter-association idea at the level of the Division of Student Affairs at your institution, or even across the organization itself, where you might be able to pull in a group of like-minded colleagues and say, what does it mean for us to institute some of these ideas across our spaces and to do so in such a way that we're able to show the positive benefits of this, and in that way, make a persuasive case for scaling. So I've got a couple of examples in the book where this was not a huge institutional change, where it was a strategic priority that they identified and everybody moved together towards the goal. Instead, I've got a lot of examples of pockets where somebody said, we've got an idea, we think it's got legs, we pulled in some partners, we're going to start rolling with it and see where this goes. And then somebody else at the institution said, I see what you're doing there. This seems like a good idea. How can we move this along a little bit? And that process is not revolutionary, right? We're not going to see radical change by that, and it's going to be frustrating. And it doesn't eliminate the fact that there still may be toxic folks along the way that make it much harder to do. But I do see a lever for change in those pockets where we pull together some like-minded teammates and say, in what way could we kind of push this forward in our spaces?
Thank you. Thank you. So the next question also harkens back to this raising literacy piece. And I know I started our conversation about how we use the term well-being a lot, and we all don't agree on what it means. And so I have a question that's come up specifically about employees. Kind of from your perspective, how are you distinguishing or determining the difference between employee well-being versus employee wellness? And in that same vein, what about employee satisfaction versus employee well-being? So how are you grappling with the distinctions between those constructs?
You all probably could teach me more about how I should be thinking differently about wellness versus well-being. And so that may be something that I need to explore a little bit further. I'm kind of taking my cues around wellness, as I said, using this idea or well-being, again, taking cues from the framework around 5 essential components of workplace well-being, and then really pulling from my own data around kind of what employees themselves are saying that they need in order to achieve this kind of sense of well-being at work. And I think as an example, well-being for me looks like the types of conditions that are kind of a counterpoint to the conditions that lead to burnout, disengagement, and demoralization. So if we take that as a starting point, as these are the types of things that would lead to somebody saying, I've got to exit this place. I have got to step away from this place. The physical workplace experience is making me ill. If we take the kind of counterpoint of those and think about how we can address those points, then that's a starting point. To be honest with you, I have not built satisfaction into my thinking about this much at all. That's not to say that I don't think satisfaction is important. I think that satisfaction probably is in many ways connected to some of these ideas. But my starting point, as I said, wasn't thinking about what may lead to satisfaction, what may lead to happier workers. It was really thinking about how do we create these spaces where somebody says, I'm able to invest fully in my work. This is a place where I feel as though I am not constant in a space of constant stress that's going to lead to burnout. In what ways are the values of the organization consistent with what's written on the website and consistent with my own personal values? So I say, I got into this work because this is what I believe. I think this is an organization that believes this, and I see it reflected in the actions. And so I think through some of these organizational changes, we get closer to conditions where that is possible. And it may mean that we're more satisfied and we're happier in the process, but that wasn't, for me at least, that wasn't the primary thing that I was thinking about with some of this.
Thank you. Thank you. And you also hit on, you started touching on this, on burnout, and you were talking about that in the presentation as well in your most recent response. And someone asked about ideal worker norms and how, they feel like they were there themselves in that ideal worker norm space, and that it can take a toll on you when you are in that space. And then because it takes a toll on you, you might change out of that space at some point in your career. But how do we, as leaders, help folks realize that ideal isn't always sustainable?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think ideal worker norms are pervasive in higher education. And one of the things that I've grappled with is trying to kind of differentiate structuring jobs around this kind of set of ideal worker norms versus simply having high expectations where people are performing at their best and they want to work hard for the organization. And I think there is a tendency sometimes when we talk about ideal worker norms for some folks to react and to say, it doesn't feel like this is a space anymore where we can expect a lot out of people or that we can't push each other to achieve something bigger or better. And that's really not the idea at play. Ideal worker norms, I think, for me, are designed to get at a set of workplace expectations that were not designed for all people. They were in many ways designed for someone, frankly, who looks like me, um, and in that way, set up jobs so that someone who looks like me is much more able to be successful. I can come and I can work an uninterrupted workday from 9 to 5. I'm able to travel for work if necessary. I can self-finance my own professional development. Keep that email on my phone. I check it regularly. I live or die for this place. I bleed the colors of the institution or whatever the mantra may be. And that's how I roll. Um, I do think that recognition is and awareness is a big step in this because a lot of us who may have gone through a traditional student affairs program, we may have been in a graduate assistantship where like right out of the gate, we were in the land of ideal worker norms. And our understanding of what professionalism is and what professional excellence looks like is in many cases a reflection of those norms. Um, and by coming to an awareness of it, it helps us to understand our own experience and to look back on that and to say, you know what, that wasn't great because guess who wasn't able to be as successful in that space? I remember this person over here, and you know what? They were brilliant. They had so much to offer, but the way that they walked in the world was a little bit different, and their understanding and the way that they showed up professionally may have been a little bit different, but it doesn't mean they were any less effective or didn't bring or brought less to the work. And then as we move forward with that awareness, with that reflection, we can pause and say, what does this mean for me as a leader? What does this mean for the way that I want to show up to work now? How do I write job descriptions? How do I do performance reviews? What am I modeling in the workplace? If I'm saying to folks, you know what, I want you to set your boundaries. I want you to do your thing. I'm not going to do that though. And I understand that I'm your model for what professional excellence looks like, but I'm doing things differently. And so you kind of create this dualism where you're encouraging people to do this sort of thing, but you yourself are modeling something very different. And so through that, and potentially through higher level conversations where your division head, a dean may be willing to have some conversations around this, we might be able to identify practices within our unit or at the institution where we say, this is maybe serving a small fraction of our employees, but it doesn't allow us to be excellent in a way where we're inclusive of everybody that has something to offer here. Um, I think about the fact that we just have a significant number of people who are in caregiver roles who have been pushed out of the workplace. They've been pushed out of jobs. They've been pushed out of offices because they are responsible for the life of somebody else. And they cannot give up that responsibility because we think that student success is important. Like, that's just not a good enough reason to stop being a mother. And so we have got to think a little bit about ways in which we kind of set a series of goals for ourselves and for our units that are just not in step with the realities of being a human. And ideal worker norms is a way for us to think about. It's not the only way. And there are some shortcomings there, but it is a way that we can kind of frame that to help us raise our literacy and maybe change how we practice.
Thank you. So the next question that I'm seeing, I think it harkens back to your 4 Rs, and two of them looking at resistance and reassignment and possible resignation. Um, but taking a step back and looking at your organization and being able to discern whether there's a problem with an individual and their attitudes versus the entire workplace and organization. Um, you know, how would you advise folks, leaders, to think about making that level of discernment, and then determining how they want to act when it comes to facilitating organizational change, or you know trying to shift the behavior, or both and. So what is your perspective on that question when someone's kind of grappling with that moment of discernment?
Yeah, that's a great question. And the truth is that if we are relying solely, for example, on like turnover data, then we are looking at a very limited picture of the employee experience. So that's one of the things right off the bat that I recommend in the book, is that our understanding of the employee experience in higher ed is very low. We are not collecting data on this. We are not doing it regularly. We're not acting on that data, despite, in some ways really stepping into a more data-informed decision-making when it comes to trying to support students. We are not doing that on the employee side. And so, you know, there are many organizations that have embraced kind of a talent management model, and that kind of says, here are our goals, here's the type of skills that an employee that we need to achieve those goals. And then here's our understanding of where those employees are at, so that we can make sure that we keep those folks, that we are attractive to hiring the ones that we need. And so that's the space where we struggle a lot in higher ed, is that we just simply are not asking about the employee experience. We're not collecting data that allows us to get at some of that discernment. So that's one piece of it. The other piece of it is, I do think it's the case that you could have an individual within an office who it just doesn't like it there. They don't love the work. This is not the right fit for them. And that may not be a like big O organizational problem. That could be much more of a smaller scale sort of situation that needs to be handled. What I've tried to do as I've stepped into this work, though, is to ask, in what ways are my perceptions of that person, a reflection of my own assumptions, my own biases, that makes it easier for me to say that that's a them problem. And then what that has allowed me to do is to say, maybe there's something more here at an organizational level that's worth looking into. It could still be the case that ultimately I land where I say, this is a person fit sort of thing. But for every instance where I say that this could be an individual, and that this is just a particularly toxic individual, I step back and say, you know what, let's reflect on it and see if there's something more at play here that's worth exploring, because it's entirely possible that with a different set of conditions and a different type of support, that's a whole different employee. And so I think there's kind of a both and at play there that's worth mentioning.
Thank you. So I know we're getting close to time, and so I want to ask this final question before we transition, and also just express appreciation again for all of these thought-provoking responses that you shared about this very, very important topic. Can you talk about this culture change, organizational change being a process, and then there are and not any one person can do this alone. And people need to find or should consider what their zone of action is. And I've seen some questions about, acknowledging how big of a change effort this is for an institution. Um, what would your recommendation be for someone who's trying to figure out what their zone of action is, given their role in the university, given their level of leadership and capital in the institution? Like, how would you guide someone or advise someone on kind of defining or determining their zone of action and doing this work?
That is also, well, first of all, these have all been outstanding questions, and this is no different. This is an outstanding question. And so, here's the honest answer here is that I have only been in this work for a short period of time relative to my whole higher ed career. This was really, for me, something that grew out of the pandemic experience and interviewing people. And I just kept going with it, and I kept asking questions about it. And so I've had to figure out what my own zone of action is in this. Writing is a type of action, certainly, but at my own institution, what does that look like? And so there are a couple of places where I've been able to kind of identify what that looks like for me. And maybe by offering these and the scale of them, it may help kind of spur some thinking for others. So the one area where I tend to be frequently involved in is thinking about kind of performance evaluation. So as faculty, we are involved in performance evaluation for other people. And so we've been really doing some work to improve upon how we go about that review of performance, thinking about how we write job descriptions and what our search processes look like. So is this a search process that is centering equity? Is it the case that we're having uncomfortable conversations as a group about our practices? I've been thinking a lot about, and this isn't something that we talked a ton about, but or we touched on a little bit, but the notion of kind of psychological safety. So which of our students and which of my colleagues, feel like they're in a position and feel safe to be able to have honesty and to be candid in our conversations. And in what ways can we set some better conditions culturally as a group to enable that to happen? Um, and then, this notion of kind of collecting data for the greater good. So I've been really pushing my own institution to think about the data that we're collecting, whether that's faculty data or within my own college, some of the data that we're collecting, to be able to say that we have a better sense of the employee experience. So individually, are all of these things going to significantly move the dial in terms of achieving the Caring University? Maybe not. But these are small steps. They're in my zone. Um, and in doing them, you're trying, I think, to connect with other people. And that small thing that you do could have a big effect for them, for one other person. And that matters. And if we are able as a group, as a profession, to embrace some of these things, I think it's possible that we see a snowballing happening where we start to say, operating differently, operating in a way that doesn't demonstrate care is not something that is going to be celebrated. We're not going to be elevating those folks. And we arrive at a different organization. Um, so what that looks like for other folks that are in staff roles, I think is a really good question, and one that I'll think about and probably need to reflect on a little bit. But I like to think about this notion of kind of small acts, small everyday acts, those moments where we stop and we ask ourselves, is there a different way that we can do this that better demonstrates care for my colleagues and for these people that I care about and want to stay here, that could add up to something bigger?
Thank you so much for that response and also for engaging with all of these questions that have come in from our colleagues. And as our time comes to an end, I'd just like to express appreciation again to you, Dr. McClure, for a thought-provoking session today.